Hi everybody, this is the Cricket Badger podcast.
Each badger marks the track with its own scent.
His black legs are short but very powerful for digging. The name badger probably comes from the French word bêcher, meaning digger.
And hello everybody, hopefully you can hear me. Tried something a bit different at the start there. You can still hear the theme music disappearing behind me as we start another edition of the Cricket Badger podcast. I'm James, as always, with you on these podcasts, and it's a pleasure to welcome today author I actually didn't ask you when we were chatting just then where you are in the world at the moment. It's Nicholas Brookes. Nick, how are you?
Hi, James. I'm very well. Thanks for having me on. And I'm in South London, confined to my bedroom because my cat has the run of the house. And if I try and pod from the living room, he'll be wandering in, biting and scratching and meowing. So, yeah, here in my bedroom in Brooklyn.
Well, I'm not sure how badgers and cats get on. So probably
find out.
Probably just as well. But it's a pleasure to see you today. And the reason you're on is because of this. And if I do this now, I'll try and get this up to my camera. An Island 11, the story of Sri Lankan cricket by, there you go, Nicholas Brookes is on there. He's got one as well. I'm sure you got plenty.
Absolutely, but double promotion.
A good thick book, this one, Nick. It's very well written as well. I actually listened to a podcast with James O'Brien, the LBC presenter, the other day. He does a really good podcast, and he had Fergal Sharkey on, and he was saying to Fergal Sharkey, you'll have to excuse me, Fergal. He says, I try and make out it's for creative reasons that I've not done a huge amount of preparation for this interview. Because sometimes that actually works if you kind of go with the flow of the interview. And I like to do that anyway. But I had a flick through this last night. So that's the preparation that I've done. You very kindly given me some pointers on email as well, so we can frame the discussion around that. But first of all, Nick, I'd like to ask you, I've written some books in the past, and it's quite a time-consuming gig, isn't it, to research them and get them out and get them in some kind of order. What led you to Sri Lankan cricket, and what led you to this subject?
I mean, really what led me to Sri Lankan cricket, James, was I think I was sort of inspired by a bit of a gap in the market, which was that every other Test nation has had masses and masses written about it, and Sri Lanka has had next to nothing. So I sort of went to the library at Lord's, and I was shocked to see this tiny column of Sri Lankan cricket books, sort of 5 or 6. And, you know, I grew up in the 90s. I was born in 1990. And I think that era of the late 90s through to the end of the noughties, a lot of people felt like Sri Lanka were their second team. Yeah. They played the game with such an incredible style. They had some incredible results. I think they produced some cricketers during that era who the world will never forget, some really unique cricketers. And so, I mean, I was drawn to the subject. There was nothing written about it. And then it was a real bonus that I got to move away from London and spend a couple of years living in Sri Lanka, right by the sea.
Because you went out to Colombo, didn't you, to do the research properly and do it on the ground?
I did. I was very lucky that I managed to get a gig teaching at St Thomas's, which is one of Sri Lanka's sort of oldest and most famous cricket schools. So I was there for just over a year teaching English. They gave me a room sort of which was just overlooking the cricket ground. I had a wonderful view, so I got to see cricket going on pretty much all the time.
I've read that little bit, and I'll read you a quote from your book. It might be better in your voice, but I'll read it. And when you first went out to Sri Lanka, during those first few months in Colombo, I understood a deep love of cricket was one of the island's defining features. As Sri Lanka, you might have to help me with the pronunciation of this.
I thought you were going to get
Sri Lankan as Rambutan?
Bang on.
Or Tambili?
Thambili, yeah, there we go.
Okay. In a patchwork society, often riven by differences of class and creed, cricket carries a rare pan-national appeal. And that is for Sri Lanka, I mean, like everywhere these days, you know, plenty of different religions, plenty of different people living there. And from what you say there, cricket is the glue that holds them together.
Yeah, it really is. I think anyone who's been to Sri Lanka will see that it's a society with lots of divisions, of religion, of class, of language. And I think cricket is the one thing that really has a sort of broad pan-national appeal, and that everyone from, the sort of guy sitting on the street corner to the richest man absolutely loves and feels kind of defines Sri Lanka.
It's a beautiful place. I mean, I was commentating off tube. Unfortunately, I wasn't actually in goal when England were playing there, but some of the drone shots they have above that place, absolutely beautiful. And I know a few people have been out to Sri Lanka. Yorkshire actually toured there, and I didn't actually manage to get on that pre-season trip, unfortunately. But nobody comes back there saying it's a horrible place to go. Everybody comes back raving about it.
No, I really think it's the best place in the world to watch cricket, and I sort of strongly advise anyone who gets the chance to go and watch cricket in Sri Lanka too. And I think especially Galle is such an iconic ground with the Dutch fort in the shadows and right on the sea. You can play ends there at 5 o'clock. So you can, if you run, you can catch a swim in the sea before sunset. After full day of Test cricket, you can stay in the fort and walk to the ground. It's a really, really magical place to watch cricket, and the Sri Lankan cricket crowd are incredibly knowledgeable, very engaged, very hospitable. Yeah, there's cheap beer, there's beautiful beaches, there's not a lot of black marks against it.
That sounds all right to me. You mentioned when you moved to Colombo to teach, the sea was a slog away from the ground that you were watching your cricket on there as well. Yeah, it's never too far away from a beach, are you?
No, you really feel like you're sort of always in touching distance. And yeah, the St. Thomas's ground was right on the beach. There was just a railway track separating the sort of ground from the beach. So it was a really magical cricket oval fringed by these tall coconut trees and with the sound of the waves lapping.
That sounds beautiful. Sometimes when you get sportsmen and women and teams, they play in the character of the place they represent. Does the Sri Lankan team characterize the island it comes from?
I think it absolutely does. I think for a long time it didn't. Probably up until the 1980s, I think there was a lot of sort of fealty to all things English, the MCC coaching manual. And I think when Arjuna Rangatunga took over the captaincy in the late 80s, 1988, I think it was, Sri Lanka really started to play their own way and developed a style which I feel is very emblematic of the country. You look, I mean, people often focus on the bowlers, guys like Murali, Ajantha Mendis, Malinga, who've done it in their own style. And there's a kind of Sri Lankan ingenuity about their bowling. But I think we see that in a lot of the batsmen as well. Jaya Surya, Dilshan, even someone like Mahela with the shots that he plays behind square. I think there's a huge amount of invention and ingenuity in Sri Lankan cricket, which kind of reflects something about the Sri Lankan spirit and the kind of madcap hedonism that the island has a little bit of.
You mentioned Malinga, the slinger, with his action. I can only remember half the story, but didn't he learn his cricket on the beach? Isn't that part of the reason his action is like it is?
I think that's the big reason, James. And it's actually probably important to say that for most people in Sri Lanka, cricket is played with a tennis ball in your local sort of alley or the beach or the coconut grove. The game that we know with hard red ball with a seam and pads and whites doesn't exist for most of Sri Lanka. So yeah, Malinga grew up not far from Galle in a village called Rathgama, right by the beach. And he played all of his cricket, I think, until he was 16, 17 on the beach. So he's got the low arm style, and it's where he developed the Yorker, because, I mean, you can't bowl a good length on sand.
It's not a bad net, is it, that, if you're learning your cricket, to do it on the beach somewhere nice and sunny? Fantastic.
No, it's great. And the beach from on the sort of west coast of Sri Lanka, it kind of runs all the way up from Galle to Colombo. So he said when he needed new batsmen to feast on, he'd just kind of wander up the coast.
To feast on. I mean, he did that all of his life, didn't he? The Brits arrived in 1796, and that's one of the common trends, isn't it, or common themes of cricket overseas, India and the subcontinent, is that it was the English or the British that took the sport there at times of colonization and what have you. And I noted you wrote that although that was good and the British out there, a lot of them stayed because it was a wonderful place, and I think they became known as burghers. in Sri Lanka, kind of British expats basically living over there. But it didn't necessarily do cricket too much good on the islands, because there was a kind of snooty approach to that it was for them, not the islanders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's this kind of colonial paradox that you find in all the countries where English people went and took cricket, is that they, on one hand, are promoting the game, trying to spread the game, but on the other hand, they're behaving in this kind of superior manner, which, if they're not kind of willfully excluding the local public, they're putting them off by their sort of superiority. So you've got things going on like the Colombo Cricket Club is formed Sri Lanka's first cricket club. It's a whites only club. Planters cricket up in the hill country, I think, stays whites only sort of right through until the 1930s, 1940s. So, I mean, it's not great. There were thankfully a couple of wonderful exceptions. A guy called Ashley Walker, who moved from England to work at a school, Royal College, and was very influential in bringing cricket to the local boys. And then another man called George van der Spar, who kind of encouraged the scope of the scene to include local cricketers.
I'm going to try something in. You might have to come up a little bit on the screen, but if I put that up.
Oh, there we go. Let me sit up a little bit.
You get your little face in there, and then we'll be all right.
There we go.
I as I say, it's a really well written book, and it's chunky. You know, it's I imagine this is a tremendous book to take on holiday with you if you're traveling somewhere sunny. It's sunny in England at the moment, isn't it? Lying on a sun lounger next to the pool reading that, if you're a cricket fan, would be a very good way to spend your time, I would think. As I said to you at the start of this, you helped me out a little bit with this interview I asked you to give me sort of 5 or 6 landmark changing moments of Sri Lankan cricket as it progressed. And you've done that, and you've come up trumps, and you've given me notes as well on it. The first one, Nick, the opening of the Suez Canal and the whistle stops. Tell me a little bit of the background of that. And there's an interesting reason why they were called the whistle stop tours, weren't they?
Yeah, there is. So this opening of the Suez Canal, something which ostensibly has nothing to do with cricket, in 1869. But in those days, and probably now still, ships couldn't travel between England and Australia without a stopover. And Colombo emerged as the natural point of transit. So most ships traveling between England and Australia would stop over for a day or two in Colombo. And then, so I think the Suez Canal was built or completed in 1869.
Okay.
13 years later, we get the start of the Ashes, with Ivo Bly taking his team to Australia. And you've got, in the meantime, in Colombo, lots of members of the CCC who are British expats and who maintain connections with the MCC. And so they sort of write a letter saying, you're stopping in Colombo anyway, why don't you stretch your legs and have a day's cricket? And that leads to the start of a tradition called the whistle stops, which is, they were so called because supposedly the ship would stop, let all the cricketers off, and then the captain would whistle from the harbour when it was time for them to get back on and carry on their journey.
I take it he wasn't whistling. It was the boat whistling, wasn't it?
It was the boat whistling. Yeah, he was.
You need a big whistle, wouldn't you?
And so that carries on, I think, up until 1965. So the first one is in the late 1880s, and then we've got sort of almost a century of English and Australian teams stopping over and playing sort of casual one-day games in Colombo. And I think the important thing to remember is that at that time, Sri Lanka was really kind of marooned in a cricketing sense. The local scene was very small, based around a sort of few Colombo schools and clubs, and there were very few sort of international appearances. So these kind of annual visits from English and Australia really kind of nourished the scene. They sort of fueled, I think, Colombo people's cricket imaginations. And they also gave the cricketers a kind of yardstick or a measuring pole to see where they were at. And I think oftentimes they found that they were better than they thought they were.
That was something I was going to ask you, actually. Kind of, if we broaden that out to current times, obviously COVID played a part in the international fixture list being decimated to some extent, but the likes of Afghanistan, Ireland, Scotland, and some of the smaller nations, Nepal and various others that are trying to make their way now on the international stage. we talk about, I mean, they've limited World Cup places. Thankfully, that's changing again. But having these opportunities to play the big boys, in inverted commas, gives you that chance to see where you are, to kind of measure whether you're any good or not, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's really important, James, and I think we need more contests in cricket between big and small. I mean, I think it speaks volumes that the last whistle stop, I believe, was in 1965. So at that stage, England was still going to play in Sri Lanka as a favour. And 30 years later, Sri Lanka were world champions. And I mean, that just shows how quickly cricket nations can rise. And on the other side of things, I think they can fall if they're not nourished properly. We saw Kenya beating Sri Lanka at the 2003 World Cup. And I think 20 years later, a repeat of that would be very unlikely. So I think that the ICC has a duty to the smaller nations to try and get them more games against the big boys, to encourage big versus small matches. And who knows where cricket can go if we encourage other countries to get involved.
We'll come on to a Sri Lankan giant killing a little bit later, won't we, on your list? But you've put here the last line on the notes you've given me here about the opening of the Suez Canal and the whistle stop tours. Famous days: Kellart bowls Grace in 1890. Bradman visited the island in 1930 and 1948. Tissera handles West Hall for a century in 1961. So all of those moments, we talk about the yardsticks and seeing those famous players coming to your island, but also having some success against them too.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one, which I gave you, James, in 1890, Tommy Kellart, I think he was 19 at the time. He was one of the first Sri Lankan cricketers to be included in the Ceylon side, which up till then had been full of colonists. And I think it's important to mention that Grace was probably the most famous sportsman in Victorian Britain and carried this kind of incredible mystique in an age before radio or TV.
Yeah.
And him coming to Colombo was big news. The governor ordered sort of stands to be taken down so the ground Gulface could accommodate the many. And this was a huge day out for the Colombo public. And I don't think anyone expected a sort of young Sri Lankan medium pace bowler to get rid of Grace. I think he was on 19, and WG supposedly sort of walked up to him, patted him on the back, and then hid in the pavilion for the rest of the day. And so I think
he didn't do his line of "They've come to see me, I'm staying here."
No, apparently he was very annoyed because there was a famous explorer, I think it's H.M. Stanley, who was sharing the ship with them, and he turned up at the cricket and stole away some of Grace's spotlight. And so he was very peeved and he sulked in the pavilion.
That's good. That's a really good story. I mean, WG Grace was, I'd imagine in those days when you just saw grainy pictures of somebody and there's a big man with this big beard, the legend kind of grows, isn't it? Because you don't have social media. If WG Grace had a Twitter feed, it might have been a different kind of landscape. Number 2 on your list here: unofficial test win over India, Ahmedabad in 1965. So that was a day where, against an established side, Sri Lanka punched above its weight and again tested itself against a big boy and came good.
Yeah, absolutely, James. I think what's important to say is that in the 1960s, the Sri Lankan scene was still totally amateur, as it really remained through to the 90s. But, these guys had full-time jobs. They were getting in an hour's practice at the end of the day. And this was the first big tour of India that Sri Lanka had been on since 1930. Michael Tissera had just taken over as captain, and there was a sense that Sri Lanka were on the charge. This was a team of coming cricketers, but this was still very much a case of amateurs versus professionals. And I think that's reflected in the kind of travel conditions that Sri Lanka had, or Ceylon, I should say, as it was still up until 1972. I think they did 15,000 miles of train travel during a 3-month tour, even a 6-week tour. There were no sort of fancy 4 or 5-star hotels. Everything they stayed in was very much a rest house with sort of flat beds, and they'd been hammered in the first 2 tests. They were beaten by an innings in Bangalore, I think, the first test, and then in the second test in Hyderabad, they'd battered themselves into a position where they could draw the game, only to collapse and then let India score 150 in 30 overs to win the match. So they go to Ahmedabad for the third test. They're 2-0 down. It's been the kind of tour which has, let's say, tested spirits. Stanley Jar Singer, who was probably the most famous member of the side at this stage. He'd been playing cricket in England as a county cricketer for Leicestershire. He is able to travel by virtue of doubling up as a correspondent for one of the Sri Lankan dailies. And he kind of uses that platform as a journalist to sort of criticize some aspects of the team's performance, quite a lot of aspects of the team's performance. And one of the fast bowlers, Norton Frederick, gets sent an extract that's been written about him, and he sort of is pretty unhappy, and he has Jar Singer sort of by the scruff of his neck. So things are at a low. The team are earning 15 rupees a day, for a lot of them being on tours costing them money. And then they get to Ahmedabad, and the weather is just terrible. It rains all day. It rains for much of the second day too, but there are about 20,000 fans in the ground. So Pataudi, the India captain, says to Tissera, why don't we toss? Let's get going. And Pataudi wins the toss. And I think because he's got a fever, there's only about a day left to play. He decides he'll have a bat because he thinks that he'll be able to sit up in the pavilion and come back tomorrow. And that really kind of, those moments change the course of Sri Lankan cricket history, because I think India rack up 180 in their first innings. And by the end of day 3, Sri Lanka 144 for 7. Michael Tissera takes the decision that their best chance to win the game is to declare overnight. So sort of first thing on the final morning, he declares. India are totally shocked.
That's an adventurous declaration, isn't it?
Really adventurous declaration, a bit of a masterstroke. Then India, I mean, on I think a sort of drying, horrible wicket, a run through for 66, and Sri Lanka knock off the runs to get that first unofficial test win. And that immediately leads to India proposing that they're promoted to become an associate member of the ICC. And so really, I think that's a massive moment. They strike that victory, they get recognition. And as the board president says at the time, that puts them on the map of world cricket.
The 1965, the date for that, you're right at the start of the book, that right up until the 1970s, a lot of the team was made up of not necessarily Sri Lankan nationals, but the burghers, the expats that had come over, who had taken cricket to the island and were still playing it really for the national team.
Yeah, there were a lot of Dutch burghers, especially in the side. You look at, I think, guys like David Hine, Michael Tissera, two of the very influential batsmen in the 60s and 70s who were still burgher. And you are still seeing burgher cricketers even now in Sri Lanka. I think the one that comes to mind is Jeffrey Van der Say. But so, yeah, that burgher influence, I mean, which was very strong during the first half of the 20th century with guys, the Kalats, the Deserums, Cecil Horan, these sort of, a lot of the early great cricketers were of men of burgher stock, and there are less now, but you do still see the occasional burgher cricketer.
Well, it's not a bad thing, that is it? It's all part of the rich tapestry of the island, I guess.
Absolutely. No, I think that's fantastic about Sri Lanka, is this kind of, this rich tapestry. It's so rare that island has had sort of 3 colonial orders. And then Sri Lanka just feels like this incredible melting pot with influences coming from all over the shop. And I think it's great.
I mentioned before, there was the giant killing, which is the next one on your list, the win over India at the World Cup in 1979, which ultimately led to Sri Lanka getting test status. That of the ones that I think about from a distance, that seems to me to be the real pivotal moment where everybody sat up and properly took Sri Lankan cricket seriously.
Yeah, and I think that was absolutely massive. I think it's worth me saying, James, that Sri Lanka could have maybe got test status in 1968 when they were meant to tour England, but that tour fell apart because the selectors picked themselves. And then Sri Lanka were really growing.
So go back to that bit. Say that again.
The selectors picked themselves. I should say that one of them was the wicketkeeper in the team, but he decided to promote himself to captain. And the chairman of selectors, who had been elected a couple of years earlier and promised that he was out, decided that he was back in. I think, in those days, a trip to England was a bit of a rare treat, and it seems to have enticed like forbidden fruit, shall we say.
I always used to think when Ed Smith was the chairman of selectors for England that one day he was going to pick himself, but never actually got around to it. But obviously in Sri Lanka, it was a different story. that win over India at the World Cup, though, that's where you start to believe, isn't it? That's where you start to think, we've tested ourselves, we've had all of this history, but all of a sudden now we're on probably one of the biggest stages in the world, and we've won.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sri Lanka had really been growing through the 70s, and if anything, it was the sort of foreign exchange concerns and their lack of cricket infrastructure that held them back. But then you get to the 79 World Cup and a huge win over India, a team with Gavaskar at the top of the order. And I think that's the point when I think everyone had known that Sri Lanka were good for a while. I mean, they put up a good fight against Australia in 75 at the World Cup. But I think that's really the moment when it's now undeniable. The first time an associate has beaten a test team at the World Cup. It's a huge win. And actually, Sri Lanka were a smidgen away from qualifying for the semi-finals of that tournament. There were issues over the squad that was picked. So, I mean, if they weren't quite at full strength, they might have done even better. And I think from then on, you really know that Sri Lanka are heading towards test status. And the final sort of piece of the puzzle is Gamini Dissanayake becoming board president in 1981. He was a very high-ranking member of the UNP government, and he basically has the means to do stuff that other people can't. So he can convert Asgiria into a test ground very quickly. He can, lobby the English more effectively. And so, yeah, but that win against India is sort of that pushes Sri Lanka. I mean, I said to Jared Kimber the other day, it was a giant leap. It takes them from sort of here to here, and they were suddenly undeniable.
Just going back to the Burgess thing and the British expats and their descendants still being on the island and playing the cricket, I'd imagine as that's kind of transitioned to being, longer term Sri Lankan nationals playing the game, as supporters on the islands, when you can see one of your own actually succeeding as opposed to somebody else that maybe doesn't look quite the same as you, that has a big impact, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. But I think it's sort of important to say, James, that probably from the burghers sort of mixed and blended, and so and it was largely the Dutch burghers who had kind of mixed into society, and so they were kind of it wasn't quite like there were sort of 3 or 4 Englishmen in the team by the 60s and 70s. I think it was.
Where does the word burger come from? Bhergger, isn't it?
Burgher. I have absolutely no idea where that term comes from.
Very strange name, isn't it?
Yeah, I would have thought it's a Dutch term, but I couldn't say with any confidence.
I keep thinking of beef burger every time I say it. So they've had the win over India at the World Cup in 1979. They get test status in 1981. And I'm unfortunately an old enough vintage to remember that. And Lord's 1984. Now that was huge, wasn't it? That was massive. That was because I think you get a tendency where probably even now with Ireland when they played at Lord's against England, and Ireland bowled England out quite cheaply at the start of that match, but still lost. You get the impression that the kind of bigger nations, I'm not saying don't take it seriously, but just think they're going to win. Sri Lanka rock up at Lord's, the home of cricket, all eyes on the match, and they end up with the victory.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, James, it's a very good point that for the first few years of having test status, you're still a minnow, really, aren't you? And you're still disregarded.
Yeah.
And so Sri Lanka rock up in August. I mean, they've been around in England for a while, playing lots of the counties, while England have been getting hammered 5-0 by that just remarkable West Indies side.
I remember that well.
Yeah, and so I guess, I mean, you probably remember the sort of a bit of the narrative that the Sri Lanka test was a chance to restore a bit of pride and a bit of dignity after a long, hard summer when I think about 40 different cricketers had played for England. And
that was a summer where if you had a favourite cricketer and you were hoping he was going to get picked for England, by the end of the summer he had done, and his career had finished as well.
And I think that the thinking was that Sri Lanka were going to get hammered. There were rumours going around that the groundsman had been told to make an absolute road just to prolong the shellacking, essentially, to get 5 days of cricket. So you've got the English probably weary and taking the challenge a little lightly versus the Sri Lankan team who, haven't played many tests outside of Asia and are given one test And, I think it was Siddharth Wetamuni, the opening batsman, who said to me, for us, this is like going to Wimbledon. This is a huge, huge moment. And, they make hay in the sunshine. Siddharth Wetamuni bats and bats and bats and scores 190, which I think in terms of time remains the longest innings ever played at Lord's. Dilip Mendis,
he ground that out, didn't he? He really did.
He really ground that out, but they kept kind of bowling wide to him, and I think thinking that he was just going to leave it alone. Then he just lent on these sort of gorgeous square drives, and then a young Rangatunga scores at 80 odd, and by the time Dilip Mendis comes in, I think Sri Lanka are 200 for 4, and then he tucks into both of them with real glee. Dilip, for those who don't know about him, was about 5'3", but he loved to hook, and I think balls were disappearing left, right, and centre.
It's funny, isn't it, how some of the smaller batters are the best hookers, because I guess it doesn't have to be that short to bounce high to them, so they get used to playing that shot early, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, the same was said about Aravinda, who was a similar height, and I think that, to other batsmen, what might be good length or a back of a length is practically a bouncer to him. So, I mean, it really, there's bowlers have to change their lengths, and there's less margin for error, I think, when you're bowling a guy who's a little bit shorter than you're used to.
I remember being really disappointed when Wetamuni didn't get his double 100 in that match.
Yeah, I don't think you were the only one, because I don't know if you know Uncle Percy James, who's kind of Sri Lanka's greatest fan. He's been following the team around with a flag for probably 50 odd years now, and he was getting ready to run inside the boundary rope and run around the pitch. And so he was disappointed, but he said maybe it was lucky because he thinks he would have ended up in jail.
How was that received back home, that victory against England? I mean, the fact it's England as well, the kind of colonial past of the island too. I mean, that's a major scalp, isn't it?
It was a huge scalp. I mean, I think it is important to say that contests against England always carry a little bit of extra kind of spice because of that history. I think, just the performance, even though Sri Lanka didn't get the win and it was a draw, Dilip Mendis being a sort of smidgen away from twin centuries, he would have become only the second man to do that, I think, at Lord's after George Headley. 3 centurions in the game, and they really dominated England from start to finish. I think there was also, lots of the press remarked on the contrast between the beauty of Sri Lanka's batting and the utterly charmless way that England were playing. I think it was a moment where the team's sort of perception of themselves changed overnight, and also the image of this Sri Lankan team. I mean, Wetamuni was named one of Wisden's 5. There were just, the British press were really effusive and glowing about the way that Sri Lanka had played cricket. And I think there was a sudden awareness of sort of Sri Lanka's cricketing worthiness.
And I guess it changes their own self-belief as well. All of a sudden, you hear a lot of people that it's imposter syndrome, basically, isn't it? You take that step up. Are we good enough? Can we do this? Yes, we can.
Totally. And I think that this was really the moment that Sri Lanka got over that imposter syndrome, and you get the first test victories at home against India in 85 the next year, and then another one in Pakistan, or against Pakistan in 86. And I think that those days at Lord's in 1984 were the real first time when Sri Lanka knew that they belonged and understood that they were really, really good.
That then translates to a little bit of a run of success then, doesn't it? That belief, the first win under the belt, leads to a few more over the next few years. But the next one on your list is one of the biggest of all, isn't it, really? Number 5 on your list, Australia, 1995, and then the 96 World Cup. And it was, from memory, that was a little bit of a shambles, wasn't it? And then turned into glory.
Indeed. I thought I had to band these two together, James, because they were, temporally, they were pretty close. I think the World Cup kicked off in March, and Sri Lanka came back from Australia in January. And as you say,
your book starts with this as well, doesn't it? The shambles part.
The shambles part, Murali being no-balled on Boxing Day by Daryl Hare, which is just a huge moment, because it bonds the Sri Lanka team together massively. I think that feeling of, everyone's against us, our backs to the wall. And I think in earlier times, there would have been, the natural response would have been for Sri Lanka to kind of bend over and send Murali home, play sort of, diffident and go along with what Australia wanted. But this was a time when Arjuna Rangatunga said, we're absolutely not doing that. Murali's been bowling for a long time. There's nothing wrong with his action. I'm going to stand by my man. And I think you see a bit of steel, a little bit of extra steel coming into Sri Lankan spines as a result of Murali being no balled and the way that Sri Lanka responded to that.
Arjuna Rangatunga, he's a big figure, isn't he, in that transition from being effectively amateur to being test and World Cup winners. He had that steel. He led them really well. I mean, and he wasn't particularly a sporty looking fellow. I remember watching him, and quite a squat, round kind of figure, wasn't he? But yeah, really did lead that team brilliantly.
No, I mean, he was absolutely huge, James. I think you're right to say that he wasn't necessarily the lithest, and I think he was pretty un-Sri Lankan. I always think that Sri Lanka is a fairly conflict-averse place and quite a conflict-wary people, but Arjuna just took no shit from anybody. And, in an age where I think a lot of teams were kind of deferential towards Australia and were trying to mimic what they did, Arjuna went out of his way to really kind of get under their skin. And
do you think that's a thing of the sort of South Asian teams? Because you're seeing that quite a lot with India now. Who are you to tell us how to play Test cricket? We're going to play Test cricket our way, that kind of thing. And I seem to think, I mean, speaking to quite a lot of Indian supporters around the England series recently, it does seem to come from that colonial history of, you've always told us what to do. You've always been in charge of us. You're not anymore. We're going to tell you how to behave, kind of thing. And we're going to play cricket our way.
I think you're right, James. I think it's not unfair to say that the Asian sides were bullied for a long time. And there's a story in Sri Lanka where, everyone else was sledging. And I think it was the assistant manager at the time said, what's sludging? He didn't even know what it was, because Sri Lanka just didn't do that until they played gentleman cricket, until Rangatunga came around and said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to be pushed around. And I don't think it's unfair to suggest that there was a kind of racial element or racial undertones in it. There were reports on that 95-96 tour of Sri Lanka coming up against sort of racial elements. And I think this team stood tall. They stood proud. They said, we're going to get back at you. And, at the same time, you've got this powerful symbol of Jayasuriya and Kalawitarana being installed as the new opening pair together on that tour. And I mean, kind of changing the way that teams go about cricket, attacking in the power play. I know we'd seen great batch and Botham used as pinch hitters before, but the idea that those first 10 overs really were to score as many runs as you can, I think that changes, is a huge shift in cricket's landscape. And then the kind of openers who we see appearing in the late 90s from around the world, we've got guys like Afridi, Sehwag, Gale, Kershaw Gibbs, Gilchrist
and White Ball, yeah.
Yeah, I think
sorry, Nicholas, would it be fair to say that, in terms of maybe the three pivotal men in Sri Lankan cricket in that period of transition when they were stepping up onto the big stage, we mentioned Rangatunga and his leadership was crucial. That then in the batting stakes, you've got Jayasuriya, who was just crazy good and fantastic to watch, and maybe made some of his teammates think, well, if he can do it, I can follow in his footsteps. And then obviously Murali coming in, most Test wickets and winning matches on his own at times, wasn't he? They're three very key parts of that transition, aren't they?
Three absolutely crucial parts of that transition. The other one who I would throw in there is Aravinda, who had been in the Sri Lanka side for a long time. I think he first played in 1984, but he'd been the baby of the side. I think he was always a lyrical batsman, but he used to play these sort of beautiful 30s and then get out doing something stupid.
That's what I did all the way through my club career.
That was a good day for me, so I can't chastise him too hard. But no, he went off to Kent in 1995 and had a wonderful year. And I think he came back kind of hungrier for runs, understanding that he was the linchpin of this Sri Lanka team. And then, I think he scored 7 Test centuries in 1997, and he made a really crucial 60 odd in the World Cup semi and then 100 in the World Cup final. And so I think having Jayasuriya and Aravinda kind of at the heart of that batting lineup in the late 90s was a really, really daunting prospect. And I think, I mean, I've gone away from Sanath, but I think it's fair to say that Sanath was a real, real trailblazer. He was just batting like other people weren't. And I think in 1997 or 98, he was the third highest run scorer in ODI cricket, and he scored a strike rate of over 100. And just no one else in the list is getting close to him in terms of strike rate. And so the kind of room for manoeuvre that his innings gave Sri Lanka really was quite profound.
I was actually at Canterbury. Yeah, I'm just actually, while you were speaking there, I was just Googling the game. Derek Aslett, who's a friend of the podcast, he made 221 not out in the Kent second innings to see the match through to a draw. But that's the first time I'd seen Sri Lanka live. And that Sri Lanka team, I remember watching them and thinking, this lot are all right. You got Wetamuni opening the batting, Von Hart as his opening partner in that match, Diaz, De Silva, who you've just mentioned, Mendes, Rangatunga, Karuppa, DS De Silva. Some really good names in that side, and they really gave Kent a good match on that occasion. I think the pitch fairly flattened out, and Derek Aslett played really well to see the draw through. But that was the embryonic sort of side of the one that went on to become household names, really, weren't they?
Indeed, yeah, and I think I mean some great batsmen that you listed there. I think Sri Lanka have always had batting strength. I mean, even if you go back way before Test status to the 30s and 40s, guys like Desaram and Sathasivam were, I think really world class. And then we had Tenakun in the 70s, who I think was the same. And Dilip Mendes is the one who you mentioned from there, James, who really stands out to me because he had been around from the early 70s. He was part of the first World Cup side. He was there as captain throughout the 80s, and then he was the team manager for much of the 90s. He was part of that Brains Trust in 96. And so I think his fingerprints are kind of all over those early years of Test status.
I'm getting quite self-indulgent here, just concentrating on this match at Canterbury. But just going back, it's just going down memory lane. Sri Lanka had made 340 in the first innings, bowled Kent out for 182, with DS De Silva taking a fifer. And John, I think, took 4 for 142. He did. He took 5 as well. So the 10-wicket share between those two. And second time around, take a couple of early wickets, and then Derek Aslett dug in. But it was, as I say, my first proper exposure to that Sri Lankan team, and it had a really nice feel, that match as well. I mean, you talk about sort of the deferential sort of side of it and then becoming a bit stronger, but they played hard. But there was I was only a kid at the time. I was getting autographs, and they were all really nice to approach, and it was a very friendly kind of county game, that.
Oh, it's great to hear. And I think that Sri Lanka have always been great to watch, even when they weren't winning. I think
Rangatunga got 100 in that game. Played really well.
Really? And he must have been sort of barely out of school. He must have been 18 or something.
He was batting at number 6, and he got 118.
And I mean, he was such a talented player. It's a real mystery as to how he only managed to score 4 Test hundreds. I think that he's one who you feel maybe sacrificed personal gains in the pursuit of kind of higher glories and really made himself a captain first. Getting
back, though, to your 5th point, rather than dwelling on Canterbury in 1984 for the entire podcast, there was a bombing, wasn't there, which led to Australia and West Indies boycotting playing against Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And the wheels were coming off to some degree, weren't they?
The wheels were coming off. So the Central Bank bombing, which I think is probably the most scarring event of the Civil War thus far, happens in Colombo just before the World Cup's about to start. And so the Australia and the West Indies pull out. They refuse to come to Sri Lanka. And there's sort of talk that Kenya and Zimbabwe might do the same. And if that had happened, it just would have been a total disaster and completely thrown Sri Lanka's World Cup campaign off the rails. But they managed to persuade sort of the World Cup in 96 was in Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan. And so there was a sort of joint committee called PILCOM, and India and Pakistan agreed to send a combined team to play in Sri Lanka on the eve of the World Cup and show everyone that it's safe. And I mean, this was really hurriedly organized. I think all the sort of, sight screens have been painted black and then had to be repainted white so the game could happen. I think, Wasim Akram forgot his kit and had to borrow off Azharuddin. And it was the first time Indian and Pakistani cricketers, I think, had played in the same side since partition. So this was a real show of Asian solidarity. The cricket kind of took second fiddle, I think, to the feel of communality. And that potentially stopped Sri Lanka's World Cup campaign from falling off the tracks.
And they weren't expected to win that World Cup, were they?
They weren't. I think as soon, probably 3 or 4 months before, they were 66-1 or something like that. And I think if you look at the teams at the time, certainly England, Australia, India, Pakistan, West Indies, South Africa, New Zealand. So that's 7, who I think all would have been fancied more than Sri Lanka going into that tournament.
We'll move on to number 6. You've got 7 points, and we're on to number 6 of the 7. It's fascinating, this. I'd love going down memory lane and learning a bit more about stuff that I think I know and then realise I don't. But Murali's breakout at the Oval in '98. Now, I remember this very well because, again, England going to that test very much favourites to win. And Murali tied them in knots, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. A massive moment. And I think the first thing that's important to say is a lot's changed since 1984. Sri Lanka have gone on and become world champions, but they're still given the same treatment. They're still, it's one test at the end of a summer. I think England have had a tough test series against South Africa, and they're, going to head off to the Ashes that November, December. And I think that it's probably not unfair to say that minds weren't really on Sri Lanka as much as they could have been. Murali put it to me, he said, we were not regarded. That snobbery kind of stung, and England probably weren't too pleased with the conditions they got. It's hot, it's dry, it's getting dusty. It's probably not a million miles away from Colombo. Rangatunga really surprised everyone by batting first, and his reasoning was that if Sri Lanka had batted first, England would have to follow on, and that way Murali wouldn't have got a rest, and he was going to have to shoulder a heavy workload if they were to win. I mean, it's the most kind of audacious reasoning at a toss imaginable. And I think it looks like it backfired. England made 450, I think, in their first innings, and I think from that position, never imagined to lose the game. But Jayasuriya and Aravinda batted so fluently and scored at almost 4 and over as Sri Lanka makes 600 that they put a win back on the table. And then Murali really runs through England, having taken 7 in the first innings. He takes 9 in the second innings. The only other wicket is a run out of Alex Stewart. And Sri Lanka complete victory there by 10 wickets. I think they chase off the 40 that they need in sort of 5 overs. Jayasuriya hits a 6, which is, still in Sri Lankan folklore, because I think both feet were off the ground and he just sort of swung. And
I remember that. Yeah.
It's a moment which I think, for all the success that Sri Lanka have had in the 90s, they were unreliable as a test team. They'd hardly won matches outside of Asia. And, they hadn't won a lot of tests consistently. And I think that kind of is a springboard, which it's another moment where I think the team's image of themselves changes, as well as their broader perception. And they go on to be hugely successful in test cricket during the noughties. I think when Jayasuriya is captain, I think he has about a 47% win percentage, which is better than a lot of good teams in the history of cricket. And then Mahela's, I think, is even better. So Sri Lanka kind of make that transition from sporadically winning but producing lots of good cricket to winning more consistently. Although I would caveat that with they've never been able to win consistently outside of Asia, which is probably the final frontier.
Would it be unfair to say, or fair to say, that without Murali, it wouldn't have been possible? Because obviously they've got arguably the best spin bowler that the world has ever seen. And I mean, they've got him, so he's part of their team. So it's, you can't change history. They had him in their side, but without him, they wouldn't have been the same side, would they?
No, I think that's totally fair to say, James. And he took, 800 test wickets. I think without Murali, Sri Lanka would have struggled to take 20 wickets consistently. And I mean, I think from 1992, when he comes into the side, they have a way of winning at home. And it's important to say, and I think it's a good message for all spinners, the amount that Murali improves between 92 and 98 is just drastic. He always had the big turn because of the physiology, but he really develops a huge amount of craft and guile. He learns to master sort of drift and dip. He gets much better at bowling around the wicket, and he becomes a match winner in all conditions. I think it's, without his wickets, they would struggle to win, especially away from home. And I think during his career, which, from 92 to 2010, he was injured a fair bit, but he still, I think, bowled a third of all of Sri Lanka's overs in that time, which just tells you, one thing people forget about Murali is that he was an incredibly hard worker. In that game at the Oval, he delivered more overs than any modern bowler has in a match. And, he was tireless. He was happy to just bowl and bowl and bowl until the wickets came. And, I wonder if there's ever been a more kind of influential cricketer in history in terms of match winning.
I mean, he'd bowl all day, wouldn't he? If you let him.
Would, it was really hard to get the ball out of his hand. And I think it's strange to say of a guy who took 800 wickets, but I think his mindset was kind of primarily defensive. He liked to strangle batsmen and take away their scoring options. And really the slow, tormenting assassination, which Mark Butcher got at the Oval in 98. I think he was sort of, Murali coming around the wicket to him as a left-hander, and balls were just fizzing past the outside edge. And, there were men crowded round the bat having a giggle. And poor old Butch, I think he said that his reputation as a player of spin was kind of decimated after that.
A few people were, I think, by Mitai Muralitharan. I saw there was a cracking little piece that Sky did with him on the last tour that England had to Sri Lanka, where it was Rob Key and Nasser Hussain facing Murali on a local track, and he'd put cones down or a coin down or something, and he'd not bowl for ages, and he still was able to just be accurate setting up Nasser Hussain, who obviously hasn't played for ages either, but you could just see he's still got the talent. You could probably roll him out for a county and he'd still take 60 wickets in a championship season even now, because he's it's just in him, isn't it? And it's the point I made about not having him, but you can't say that about sport, can you? Because Bradman's Australia wouldn't have been invincible probably without Bradman in the side. People are key cogs of sides, aren't they? And you can't change that. Your final point, Nick, in terms of the changing moments of Sri Lankan cricket, number 7. We'll call it, because that's the number that's next to it. Mahela Jayawardene and Tom Moody and their relationship in taking Sri Lanka on and making them, I guess, consistent and more determined and well run.
Indeed, James. And I think what's important to say is that Mahela only took over as captain, I think, probably around the start of 2006, because Marvin Atapattu had a long-standing back injury. So he's really there as a stand-in captain. But he and Tom Moody, I think, although they couldn't be two more different-looking blokes, they are two absolute peas in a pod who both are very hard workers, and they really get the most out of their charges, out of the team. I think Tom is kind of the prototypical coach you want in Sri Lanka, because, again, he's a pretty tough talking guy. He didn't take any nonsense from the administration. He kind of shielded players from the politics, which can often insinuate themselves into Sri Lankan cricket. And then you've got Mahela, who I think has an incredible cricket brain. You see the success that he's had with Mumbai Indians and Southern Brave as coach. And he's also kind of, I said in that book, I think he's a natural democratizer and a really good man manager. And you just see the team sort of go on leaps and bounds. I think
I had 3 or 4 days in the company of Mahela on and off in UAE, and such a nice fella, quite quiet, isn't he? Polite, interesting. But as you say, he was out there. He was wearing a number of caps. He was working in the media out there, but he was also making notes for the Mumbai Indians of any players that he saw, and just basically just breathes cricket, doesn't he?
I really think he lives and breathes cricket, and I think he thinks a lot about the game. And you see, I think the real turning point is where Sri Lanka come to England in summer of 2006, and they come to England in a bit of a state. I think Jayasurya's sort of retired, although he's going to come back. Tapatu's out. So really they're without a kind of noted opener. And they go way down at Lords. They have to follow on. And then they produce this kind of masterful fight back. Mahela gets 100 and I think 6 others score 50s. And they rescue this test from really a pit of despair. Draw the test series and then go on to completely smash England 5-0 in the ODIs. And that just seems like a kind of springboard, because then they go back to Sri Lanka and have a series against South Africa very soon after, which is where Sanger and Mahela produced this kind of, whatever it was, 620 odd run partnership that I feel really kind of changes again their perception that they sort of storm the bastion of the greats of cricket. And this is the same time where Sangakkara gives up the gloves. And I think from the middle of 2006 to the end of 2007, he averages 150 and becomes the number 1 batsman in the ICC Test rankings. And then you've got talents breaking out around this period. You've got guys like Malinga, Ajantha Mendis coming through. Dilshan suddenly has this just crazy late career bloom where he's kind of batted 6 for a long time and not done very much, and then suddenly he's scoring hundreds just left, right and centre. And I think Sri Lanka
and inventing the scoop shot,
inventing the Dill scoop, again kind of these innovations which change cricket. And then Sri Lanka as a white ball team just go on the most incredible run. You've got finals in the 2007 World Cup, the 2009 T20, the 11 World Cup, the 12 T20, and then they finally win the T20 World Cup in 2014. But so to go to 5 finals in the space of 7 years, I think was really quite a startling achievement.
They're in transition now, though, aren't they? They've got a number of good players. They seem to roll out slow left arm spinners that can destroy England at will. But that probably say the same about every country in the world when it comes to England's batting. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because you've had that wonderful decade or more when you have the likes of Sangakkara, Jayawardene, Malinga, Dilshan, Sanath Jayasuriya, all of these. Jaminda Vas was a tremendous player. All of those greats of the game, and certainly greats in Sri Lanka, legends in Sri Lanka, are hard to replace. I mean, we've seen this similar kind of thing in Australia's side, haven't we? When the Haydens, the Pontings, the Warnes and Gillespies and McGraths all disappeared. Yeah, you're going to go down a level, aren't you? Because sometimes they're once in a century, once in a millennia kind of player.
Yeah, totally, James. I think you're right to strike on the fact that, Sri Lanka lost a lot of these guys in a pretty short space of time. Vas, Murali, Dilshan, Sanger, Mahela. It's hard to sort of cope with those losses. And there's also, I think, the cracks were papered over because of how enduring these cricketers were. I mean,
and Murali as well. We haven't mentioned Murali.
And Murali, of course, exactly. And I mean, Murali, I think, went on, till he was probably 38, and Sangakkara was no doubt a better player in his 30s than he was in his 20s. So, their ability to endure kind of meant the problems which maybe were starting to surface 10 years earlier weren't fully dealt with, because you had 4 or 5 great cricketers who could kind of just paper over those cracks. And I think, we've had good batsmen since Sangakkara. Angelo Matthews has scored 6,000 test runs at about 45. You've had Chandimal, you've had Karunaratne, but I don't think that there's been a batsman since Sangakkara who's taken on that kind of daunting presence.
I think as well, when you've got a Jayawardene and a Sangakkara on the same side, they bounce off each other. They become their own. They're almost competing to score the most runs in the side and sharing big partnerships and there to support each other. When you've only got the one in an Angelo Matthews surrounded by maybe lesser lights, it's harder work, isn't it, for him, because he's got no support there. If he fails, then the wheels potentially come off. So when you've got a team full of greats, it's easier, isn't it?
Very much so. You need a couple of them because, you can't, no one scores 100 every innings. When you miss out, you need someone else there to pick up the slack. And
even Bradman failed sometimes.
Indeed. And I think, also in terms of wicket taking, the real question was how Sri Lanka were going to take 20 wickets once Murali went. And then you had this kind of bizarre, incredible situation where Rangana Herath re-emerges, having taken, a handful of wickets by age 30. And then to take a huge amount of wickets and carry Sri Lanka, I think they'd sort of lost that recipe for winning tests. I feel what we've seen in the last couple of months, where they won a test against Australia, lost a test against Pakistan, which they maybe should have won, and kind of, things went wrong on the last couple of days on a slowing pitch, but then they won another test against Pakistan. To win 2 of the 3 and to be in strong positions in all of them, that's the most consistent stretch of cricket I can remember from Sri Lanka for a long time. So that's really
I've said it a few times, Nick. I think Chris Silverwood is a very good coach. I think his period with England isn't reflective of his strengths as a coach. It was through COVID, the majority of it, and it was tough. I think Sri Lanka is actually a very good fit for Chris Silverwood. I think it's possibly a little bit more relaxed over there, and he can take control of that team and just run it more like a county side to some degree.
I very much agree, James. I wasn't too optimistic about the appointment off the back of the Ashes, but I think he's done a wonderful job so far. I think his sort of nice guy vibe, this easygoing thing, I think chimes really well with the Sri Lankan players. And I think you've seen senior guys who were maybe, before Silverwood took over, you thought they might be starting to sort of move to the fringes of the side. Someone like a Chandamala or Kusal Mendis. Those guys have been given some security. I think that Silverwood's shown them you have a place here, and they've reflourished. At the same time, you've got younger members of the team coming in, doing really well. Someone like Dunith Walalage, or even an older guy like Prabhat Jar Singer, who's come in at 30, 31 and taken a boatload of wickets. This is something interesting because I'm noticing a lot in Sri Lankan cricket at the moment that guys who aren't necessarily the youngest, I'm thinking of cricketers like Bhanuka Rajapaksa, Dushmanta Chamera and Prabhat Jar Singer, are taking sort of what seems like big leaps around the age of 30. I was not particularly optimistic about the direction Sri Lankan cricket was going in when I left Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, but now I'm feeling a lot more positive. And I think they've got the next few months are going to be crucial for how this team's seen with the Asia Cup and the T20 World Cup. But I think they've got a really, really dynamic bowling attack. And if they can get enough runs on the board, I feel they can surprise some teams at those tournaments.
I totally agree. I think going to that T20 World Cup, there's obviously a couple of favourites in England who are tailing off a little bit in terms of white ball, but Australia, India will be there. But then you've got West Indies, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, New Zealand. There's a whole host, probably 7 or 8 sides that could easily win that trophy if everything goes right for them and they get a fair wind and a little bit of luck and all the things you need to win a tournament. Who knows? It could be Sri Lanka's year again. Final question for you, Nick, before I let you disappear. I looked online for the top 10 Sri Lankan cricketers of all time. I'll read you out this list. This is off a random site, so this isn't anything authoritative at all. But Stanley Jar Singer was number 1. Mithai Muralitharan was number 2. Kumar Sangakkara 3. Mahela Jayawardene 4. Aravanda de Silva was 5th. Lasith Malinga 6th. Chimamanda Vas was 7th. Arjuna Rangatunga was 8th. 9th was Marvin Atapatu. And 10th was Angelo Matthews. Hard to disagree with some of that, but there is always, with things like that, a little bit of a recency bias. Your book, which I'll put alongside the graphic there, big chunky book that lists Sri Lanka all the way through the years. Is there anybody from the bygone day that could maybe, because they may not have been playing test matches at the time and they may not have had the appeal in the country at the time, but who was that was really good at that stage that would never be on a modern day list that maybe should be remembered?
I think the name that really springs to mind is Sathasivam, who was around in the 30s and 40s. He lived a very colourful life. He only played sort of probably 15 first-class matches, but Frank Worrell said if he had to pick a World 11, Sathasivam would be the first player on that.
Really?
Yeah, he wowed people with his batting wherever he went. He was a really sort of fluid touch player, the best bad wicket player that lots say they've ever seen. And he was very cavalier in the way he went about things. He'd stay up drinking and dancing all night, catch a few winks in his car, and then go out to bat and just put bowlers to the sword. So he is one who I think most cricket fans wouldn't be aware of, but deserves to be kind of enshrined in the game and has an amazing story. And then there was Anura Tennakoon, who was the captain of Sri Lanka in the 1970s. And he, I think, reached 1,000 unofficial test runs at an average of about 40, which, given the kind of sparsity of Sri Lankan cricket then, and, they were the amateurism of the scene. I think that is a really incredible achievement. I don't think it's a exaggeration to put him as world class. And a couple of recent ones, so I think we didn't have on this list. They're always a bit batting friendly, aren't they? Best lists, and we missed out. Did we not have Malinga or Herath on that list?
I think Malinga was on there, but Herath wasn't.
I think let's get him on. He deserves to be on there. He looks like a trundler, but surely one of the greatest left-arm spinners of all time.
I was going to say, actually, with Herath, I talked about Murali being responsible for a lot of Sri Lankan's wins. You never quite know. Yeah, one will never know. If he hadn't existed, there probably would have been a Herath or somebody else come in to fill that hole, wouldn't there? And Sri Lanka would have won Test matches anyway. So it's difficult to kind of besmirch Sri Lanka because they were just a one-man side, because somebody else would undoubtedly have come through and taken that job on.
Yeah, you do have to say it with hypotheticals, and the spin bowling stocks in Sri Lanka are really strong. I did a little bit of coaching, and I remember seeing a 10-year-old who was bowling leg spinners to right-handers and off spinners to left-handers, and everything was in the area where it should have been. And I thought, God, I can't do that.
Yeah. Well, that 10-year-old in just probably about 8 years' time will be rolling through England because spinners tend to queue up to do that, don't they? Nicholas Brookes, your book, it's very, very good. Get it. Tell people how they can buy this fine volume and this chronicle of Sri Lankan cricket.
An Islands 11 should be available in all good bookstores, but even easier is to pick it up online. It's on Amazon. You can get it same-day delivery on Prime or via Waterstones or Smiths, all the major sellers, and I would be delighted if you bought a copy.
You've done that before, haven't you? Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure, honestly, to talk to you, and really good to kind of go through some of the old players of Sri Lankan and how they've come to where they are now, and hopefully will be around for a long time playing cricket on the world stage, Sri Lanka. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on, James. It's an absolute pleasure and a real privilege.
And thanks out there, everybody, for watching / listening. It'll be out in its normal way later on as an audio podcast. But if you've been watching along, thank you for your eyes over the last hour and 6 minutes, or whatever it's been. I've been chatting along to Nick about Sri Lankan cricket. And there's more around the corner. We've got plenty of podcasts coming up as well over the next few weeks. So stay tuned. Keep an eye out on the @cricket_badger Twitter feed, and you'll find out what's coming up next. But until then, it's been good to have you with us, and we'll see you again very soon indeed. You can follow us, as I say, on the @cricket_badger Twitter feed. You can watch us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube when we do the live interviews like we've just done with Nick there as well. And stay tuned, as I say, because plenty more around the corner. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again.